an analysis of Rosalind Krauss's expanded field diagrams. The diagrammatic use of a kind of Kleinian logic. The diagrams she derives from Klein are, I think they're Koronoi diagrams, sometimes used in sociology. They are a little like decision trees or logical diagrams. Now, in the first iteration of her diagram, we notice a simple logic of not landscape, not architecture, sculpture. And she derived this. And in the second diagram we notice that she has question marks in various positions. In the position that she is later to substitute with the notion of architecture and landscape. So she has a square of landscape, not landscape, architecture, not architecture, and she calls landscape and architecture a complex level, and she calls not landscape and not architecture neuter. However, it was the question marks in the second diagram. I've incorporated the second and the third diagram here. It's the question marks in the second diagram that have twigged me to the idea that what else could we place in these positions that she leaves vacant. And then I looked back at her first logical iteration, her first little binary combinatorial piece of logic, and indeed it is logic. She slides across the screen in the text the notion that not landscape and not architecture is, because there's a negation, and she's thinking of this in terms of some zero or some such thing, and she calls this neuter over here. Not architecture, not landscape, neuter. And she derives sculpture, the broad field of sculpture, from this. However, her pictures, which are excellent in the article, and the article itself is much celebrated and very worthwhile article because it contains the idea of an expanded field, which the art world took close to its heart and ran with it vigorously. And it is an incredibly dynamic and vigorous idea as taken up by the art world. However, what she is trying to say in her essay is site-specific earthworks rather than the broad field of sculpture as such. She is indeed trying to broach open and create an apologia for a new broader field of sculpture. However, the logic doesn't quite stack up. Not landscape and not architecture. You've got two knots there. Not. And really what you get, not landscape, not architecture, you get not landscape architecture, not landscape, not architecture, combined. So if you take the two not qualities here, the negatives, what do you get if you have them as positive? Because they double negatives cancel out. Not landscape plus not architecture. In this addition combinatorial effect, you have landscape architecture if the knots cancel out, which they do. And this is straight logic. Neuter doesn't come into logic. Two knots do not make a neuter, and double negatives make a positive, as we well know. So this is definitely not a neuter. And neuter is not a term known to maths, or really to Klein diagrams, I suspect. So what you get is landscape architecture or architectural landscape, a garden. Now she does discuss this notion as a complex, but really the intervening quality between architecture and not architecture would be possibly not axiomatic as she has here, but landscape garden. So it begins to break down. And the complex itself that she has is also questionable. When we look back at the third diagram, where she has in place architecture and landscape, because the level of complex, you have a human-created architecture and a human-created landscape is either garden or agriculture for a very large outdoor concept, whereas landscape garden tends to be an introduction of city ideas into the country, or you have city squares, so it's a citification, if you like, of the country. So really this position here should be agriculture. And what she's trying to derive as the category of earth art would be not archaeology and not graveyard and perhaps not construction site. So if she had three, not archaeology, not grave site, not monument, not so this would close down considerably, and she could derive her earth art, which is pretty well what she's wanting to say. But as for deriving further things, which she does suggest, and this is what the art world took hold of and ran with, it's the idea that there were other categories, but first of all you need to have these categories corrected and put in a more sensible, meaningful form. So you could have architecture, you could have map or something like that, or agriculture. Landscape is not made by artists, architecture is made by artists. Grave sites can be made by artists, artist priests perhaps, artist shamans or something like that. But certainly by persons having such a function within society, artisans, if you like, sextons, something like that, you see. So it begins to break down. I think the neuter term is illegitimate in this diagram, and there's not quite a correct understanding of logic, and probably not a proper understanding of Klein diagrams either. Now this is very common in the arts, a misunderstanding of maths, a misunderstanding of science. You have Lacan, who appears to misunderstand sets and subsets and set theory, and yet he frequently refers to them. He is not an expert in set theory. And you have Freud, whom the feminists have attacked in terms of his rather perverted relationship with his niece and probably others, and his attitudes to women. And then he's been attacked also from the scientific side of clinical psychology and scientific psychology by Professor Ising, who through peer-reviewed tests and so on has discovered that Freud is inefficacious. In other words, it's not effective, it doesn't work, that patients were cured better, more frequently, earlier and more often, if they had no treatment of Freudian treatment at all. So you have to be better than that to have a method that lays claim to the public's money. Otherwise it is not Freud but fraud. And we have in economics we have Professor Paul Ormerod, who points out that the economics of the West is promoted by the rich. It is literally financed in various Chicago schools and so on by the rich, by the Rothschilds and so on, in which you have concepts of perfect competition and infinite number of firms, none of which are actually true, and they're also religious concepts. So you have a religion of economics, and he discusses this in his book, The Death of Economics. So these kinds of intellectual mistakes and serious intellectual errors are quite common in the arts or arts-related psychologies. This is the first of possibly 3 videos. This is like a sketch for a possible analysis of Rosalind Krauss's expanded field diagrammatics. And this is Phillip O'Sullivan. Thank you very much.